can Washington truly hold the Gaza ceasefire together, or is the Trump plan already slipping through his fingers amid the renewed Israeli airstrikes, and it seems that Netanyahu is setting up for further escalations?
Yes, there is much confidence in the United States that the ceasefire will hold and should hold. But let's remember that this very much depends on the parties to this agreement, which has to do basically with the Israelis and Hamas. As we know, the violations from the Israeli side in response to what they call are Hamas's violation is an indication that the ceasefire is indeed fragile. So, J.D. Vance's visit to Israel is an indication that, number one, an attempt by the United States to keep this ceasefire holding, and number two, to provide another indication that the U.S. is committed not only to the first phase of President Trump's plan, but also to moving forward to the second plan, which is obviously something J.D. Vance is telling the Israeli government that President Trump still wants to maintain pressure on all sides, including, of course, the Israeli government, to stick to the agreement as it is, of course, proceeding. So one important thing is that all parties, including the Israeli government, don't break the ceasefire so that we can move to the second phase.
Well, I mean, you said that, J.D. Vance is there obviously to sort of stabilize the situation, but we saw, airstrikes flaring up and hardliners asking Netanyahu to push for war. We also saw Netanyahu's speech at the Knesset yesterday, which was basically drumming the war drums. What tangible leverage does the U.S. Trio that includes Vance, Kushner, and Wickoff truly have to rein in the Israelis? Because it seems that the Israelis are adamant that they're going to restart this war.
Well, the United States is not paying much attention to what the Israeli government is saying internally. What they are very much concerned with is how they behave and how they commit to this ceasefire. There is an understanding in the United States that there are some factions in the Israeli government who want to move forward with the war and restart the military operations. However, there is very much commitment from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to President Trump that the war is not going to be resumed. So the sticking point here, we are talking about, as I mentioned early in my comment, we have different parties to this agreement. One of these parties, of course, is Hamas. Now, the sticking point, as you know, that President Trump's plan was a framework. It did not indicate a time frame, for example, when Hamas has to withdraw. And also, it did not include a time frame when an international force is going to go in. So this is something which is being now negotiated by the U.S. side, of course, with the Israelis and also with the Egyptian mediators. As we know, as J.D. Vance is in Israel, there is in parallel also Egyptian efforts, whether it's through the head of the intelligence who spoke to the Israelis and also Hamas, which is now in Cairo speaking to the Egyptian leadership. So there is commitment from all parties actually to move forward to indicate the specifics of this framework. As you know, think here is a sticking point, and the pressure on Hamas maintains the fact that there should be disarmament, and that is the excuse the Israelis at this point is taking to resume some partial military actions meanwhile.
But if we could talk a bit, I mean, you talked about the idea of these extremist ministers and the fringe ideas in the Israeli society in general, but there's obviously fractures within the government of Netanyahu. And Netanyahu is a man about survival. And when he started to drum the war of, restarting things in Gaza, it basically made him a little more popular. And he's thinking about, the next elections and thinking about surviving, basically. Even if the Israeli government is about genuinely trying to find some sort of solution to this, he will definitely try to survive this political battle. Do you think that the Americans are going to be able to rein him in as a person, not just Israel as a country?
So there are two ways to look at this, of course. The first one is without U.S. leverage, of course, the first phase of this ceasefire wouldn't happen initially. That is the first thing. The second thing important to keep in mind is that the U.S. maintains leverage, of course, to keep the Israelis under control and to keep the ceasefire holding. Again, like the factions in the government is something which the U.S. is very much dealing with as an internal Israeli matter, more than something which threatens substantially the ceasefire. Now, if we look at Benjamin Netanyahu as a person, like since the October 7th till now, he's trying to open different fronts of war to keep himself alive politically in his government. And my understanding is that the recent escalation in South Lebanon, rising the tone of also threats towards Iran, is an attempt actually to open other war fronts. But in my understanding, the Gaza front, the Gaza ceasefire is going to hold because without this, there will be no American support politically or even logistically to Israel. Let's remember, and I will end very quickly with this,
Yes.
that the U.S. sent actually 200 non-combatant troops to Israel to oversee the flow of humanitarian aid and the ceasefire. So there is no margin actually where the Israelis can, and I'm talking here about Benjamin Netanyahu, can try to evade the commitment to this ceasefire.
But we've seen, sir, for the last 2 years almost, that Washington has given unconditional support for the Israelis. Do you believe that now, given that there is a basis for a permanent ceasefire, that Washington will condition its military and diplomatic support on Israel when it comes to explicit compliance to the ceasefire term, or is that just a line too politically costly for the U.S. administration to cross?
The unconditional support, which you referred to in the question, indeed was given to the Israelis over the last month in their war in Gaza. But when President Trump communicated the message to Benjamin Netanyahu that this war has to stop, uh, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, actually was obliged to accept that ceasefire. Everybody knows that if it was up to Netanyahu, the war will still be continuing at this time as we speak. But because there is a very good understanding that while Israel is actually isolated on an international level,
Mm-hmm.
it can still proceed militarily, economically with U.S. support. So this is why there was a clear understanding from the Israeli prime minister that if he doesn't abide by President Trump's requirement for ceasefire, he will lose the U.S. leverage, and he cannot actually risk being isolated on international level, plus being isolated from President Trump. That will be high cost for him, which he couldn't bear. So this is why we have this ceasefire happening, because it was a U.S. requirement from the Israeli government that, look, you have been isolated on an international level. The Arab partners of the United States are very upset about the Israeli military operations, not only in Gaza, but actually going to other Middle Eastern countries. Eventually, it was a strike in Qatar. So things have to stop now, and this can be translated internally to the Israeli for the Israeli government as a win because you are returning the hostages. But at the same time, things have to proceed politically as it has been agreed between President Trump and Arab partners. Number one, no evacuation of Gaza from its people. And number two, there has to be a ceasefire, which the Israelis first have to commit to, and disarmament of Hamas. So we are now at a sticking point where Hamas disarmament has to be negotiated. There has to be time frame for this. And this is why JD Vance is there in the region. And this is why the Egyptians are talking to Hamas as we speak, so that there could be an understanding, negotiations on how to move forward.